All right, hey BattleTech friends and enemies. You know, these tactics videos are for my enemies too, to use against me if they want to. You know, you can try. Okay, so today I wanted to correct some misconceptions that I think are out there about when is it beneficial to put a veteran gunner on a mech, or another unit potentially, right? What are the situations where it is worth it in terms of battle value to spend that battle value on a more skilled gunner? So what are the benefits of a veteran gunner? Well, obviously they bump you up by 1 point on the 2-hit chart in how easy it is to hit. So a veteran gunner will turn an attack that would otherwise be an 8 to hit into a 7 to hit. Now, the factor that's by far the most important when you're deciding where it would be beneficial to have a veteran pilot is the probability curve for the 2-hit likelihoods on 2d6. So if you take a look, the benefit from an additional -1 to hit, it kind of goes down in a sense as you go further up in your probability to hit. If you're starting out hitting on 10s, and then you switch that to you hit on 9s now, like you get an extra -1 to your 2-hit, then you're increasing your probability to hit by 1.65 times, right? You're increasing it from 17% to 28%. So that's a very large kind of comparative benefit. You're almost twice as likely to hit if you move up from a 10 to a 9. Whereas if you look down at the bottom of the chart, if you move from a 6 to a 5 to hit, you're only gaining, 0.15 times improvement in your likelihood to hit. You're going from 72% to 83%. Well, 72% isn't that much worse than 83%. Those are pretty close in terms of how likely any given shot is to hit. So the benefit of going from a 6 to a 5 is definitely not 0, but it's not crazy huge the way that the benefit is from going from 10 to a 9. And another thing to just pay attention to when you look at this chart is there's a really significant jump up from 9 to 8, and 8s to hit, you got more than a 40% chance to hit. That's kind of the first 2-hit number, 8 is, where you start to feel comfortably like, yeah, you can get some reliable hits in at 42% chance to hit. 8s are the, when I have 8s to hit, that's the first place where I feel like, yeah, I've got a good chance of doing some reliable damage to my enemy here. I'm not even including 11s and 12s on the chart, by the way, because those are really long shot attacks. Like, a lot of the time, you're not even going to want to fire on an 11 or 12 to conserve heat or to conserve ammunition. Okay, so what's the moral of all this stuff about the probability chart? Well, the moral is, if your veteran gunner is changing your 2-hit numbers from 6s to 5s, that's not such a big benefit at all. Whereas if your veteran gunner is changing your 2-hit numbers from 10 to 9 or from 9 to 8, then there's a big benefit from that veteran gunner. Now, the next thing to pay attention to is that different mechs or different units have different mission roles, and some of them have missions and capabilities that are going to put them in situations where their 2-hit numbers are not as good as other mechs, or where their 2-hit numbers are better. So let's think about the Phoenix Hawk, the original Phoenix Hawk PXH-1 with the large laser, the 2 mediums, and the 2 machine guns. Right? This Phoenix Hawk, when is it going to be making an attack? Well, what do you want to do with this mech? Right? A lot of the time, you're going to be using this mech as a backstabber. You're going to be jumping it into the rear arc of your opponent and firing, pretty much a full salvo of those lasers and machine guns into the rear arc of the mech that you are attacking. So what that means is, for the majority probably of the attacks that the Phoenix Hawk makes, it's going to be taking the +3 2-hit penalty from jumping when it makes those attacks. It also means the mech is typically going to be making attacks at short range, because you're going to want to, if you're jumping to attack somebody from behind, you're almost always, if it's convenient, you're going to want to go into the hex directly behind them, because then you can get a kick in as well. And as you can see on the way I've written up this chart, typically those aren't going to be the only penalties that you take. You know, the jump penalty isn't going to be the only penalty you take in an attack. You know, your opponent is going to be moving their unit, they might be moving it into cover. So, you know, in a typical turn, they might have a +2 bonus. Maybe they're standing in heavy woods. You know, maybe they move to get into those heavy woods, so they might have a +3 bonus. Sometimes they will go slow, or they'll just be standing in light woods, so they only have a +1 bonus. But in my experience, a +2 or a +3 is more typical for most of your targets in BattleTech. So you add all this up, and a regular skill gunner inside that Phoenix Hawk is going to typically have a 9 or a 10 to hit. Okay, so that's exactly in that sweet spot that we were just talking about, because you turn a 9 into an 8, you turn a 10 into a 9, you've almost doubled your likelihood to hit. So the original Phoenix Hawk is a mech that very much benefits from having veteran pilots. And you know, we can generalize this to the conclusion, if you have a mech that is a jumper and a backstabber, and it is using regular weapons rather than pulse lasers, so it doesn't have kind of special other benefits on its 2 hit numbers, a mech like that, if you have the points for it, you do want to give it a veteran pilot, because a lot of the shots that it's going to be making are going to be shots where a veteran pilot gives you a major bonus to hit. Not every Phoenix Hawk is like this, so some of the Phoenix Hawks rely heavily on pulse lasers. And you know, here I've shown you the kind of maximum absolute version of that type of Phoenix Hawk, the Phoenix Hawk 3PL. This mech, its arsenal is, you know, heavily relies on pulse lasers, and this mech also has a targeting computer on board, so it's getting a total of -3 to hit for most of its attacks. What that means is you put a regular pilot on that mech, and in the same kind of situations we were just talking about, where you're jumping into the rear and your opponent has moved a bit or they have some cover, you're going to be hitting on 6s or 7s. So a veteran is only going to turn those into 5s or 6s. And like we saw on the probability chart, there's not that big a difference between a 5 or a 6. Nor is there really a big difference between a 6 or a 7. So if I'm playing for BV, I would basically never take anything better than a regular pilot on board a Phoenix Hawk 3PL. There's just no need. It has so many other bonuses to hit that you just, you know, you take those and no veteran pilot is necessary. Now another type of mech that I think doesn't really benefit very much from a veteran pilot is a frontline brawler mech like this Thunderbolt 5S. You know, when you think about what kinds of attacks this mech is going to be making late in the game, I mean, if your playstyle is anything like mine, your Thunderbolts or similar mechs are going to be right up front later on in the game. You know, once the game really gets going, this mech is going to be probably in hand-to-hand melee combat with enemy mechs, right? You're going to be up close, firing medium lasers, firing SRMs, and yeah, probably punching or kicking if you get the chance. So this is a mech that is going to be firing its weapons at short range a lot of the time, and a lot of the time it's going to be engaged with enemy brawler mechs, or if the game is going good, it will be kind of closing in and attacking your enemy's long-range mechs. So you're not going to be necessarily moving at a high speed a lot. I would expect this mech to be walking in a typical turn later in the game. Maybe you would be running, but I do a lot of walking with my Thunderbolts later on in the game. Just enough movement to get the Thunderbolt adjacent to something so that it can land a physical attack in addition to its weapon attacks. So what that all adds up to is, against a typical opponent who is moving a bit or taking some cover, you know, a Thunderbolt with just a regular pilot is going to have 7s or 8s to hit in a lot of turns. And that's already pretty good. The extra benefit from reducing that to a 6 or a 7 is not that great. So for the role at least that I assign to the Thunderbolt in most of my games, which I think is the standard role for the Thunderbolt, I don't think you want to give it a veteran pilot. And that goes for other close range brawling mechs. You know, something like, something like an Orion. Not much reason to give that thing a veteran pilot. Some close range brawling mechs like a Guillotine or a Grasshopper, those will often be jumping. And so then you might want to think about giving the mech a veteran pilot, unless it has pulse lasers. But for a standard Grasshopper, I would consider giving it a veteran pilot, because that's an up-close brawling mech, but a lot of the time it's going to be jumping to get into its enemy's rear arc. Now, another kind of mech where I would tend to want to put a veteran pilot on board is a long-range support mech, like a sniper, or in the case of the archer that I'm showing you here, a mech that is kind of like an LRM indirect fire support mech, potentially. Now, in the middle of the game, and maybe even into the late game, where are you going to be with your archer? You're going to be at 14 hexes, right? Or something like that. You're going to be at medium range, shooting targets from the safety of that distance with your long-range missiles. And depending on how your opponent is maneuvering, you might be taking indirect fire shots with the archer. Or, a way that people will often play the archer is you use it as a direct fire mech early in the game. Maybe it takes a little bit of damage, and then in the mid or the late game, you retreat it behind cover, and you use it as an indirect fire mech. So in these kind of situations, you might be taking extra penalties. You might be taking the +1 indirect fire penalty. You might be taking spotter modifiers. Maybe your spotter is moving, or maybe they're shooting, right? So those modifiers add up really quickly, as you can see from the chart here. So late in the game, or mid-game, from the mid-game to the late game, basically, I think the archer is typically going to be in that zone where a -1 to hit is a really big benefit to it. Turning a 9 into an 8 is great. Turning a 10 into a 9 is almost obligatory if you want to actually do some damage to your opponent. So this is a mech that really benefits, I think, from a veteran pilot. And by the way, everything I've said about the archer here goes double for the kind of, battle value cheap vehicles that you use to do solely indirect fire, right? Something like an LRM Partisan, or especially if you're playing with LRM carriers, whenever I use an LRM carrier, like the vehicle LRM carrier, the tank, I give that thing a minimum of gunnery 3. And, a lot of the time I'm going to give that vehicle an elite gunner, because it's not that expensive to do it. And it's just such a big benefit when you are doing indirect fire to have a highly skilled gunner. So at the end of the day, our lesson here, just more broadly, is you want to think about what is the role that a given mech is going to have, and is that a role where it is going to be potentially, typically hitting on 9s and 10s, or is it a role where it's going to be typically hitting on 7s and 8s? And if it's the kind of role where your shots are going to be more difficult and you're going to be hitting on 9s and 10s a lot of the time, then you want veteran gunnery skill on that mech if you can afford the battle value for it. And if you can't afford the battle value for a veteran gunner, you might start to think, maybe this isn't a game where I should be taking that mech, because, especially something like an archer, it's not that easy to make good use of an archer unless you have a veteran gunner on board. So I haven't gone over all the roles here by any means, so there's definitely room in the discussion, in the comments, to talk about this. If anybody has questions, or if you have your thoughts about which roles mechs might have that would be more useful for veteran gunners versus regular skill gunners, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this question.